Good morning, and welcome to all the bright and eager faces here in Berlin on this gray morning, so it's good to be inside. Since I've been given a few extra minutes, I'm just going to take advantage to say a few words about the speaker who will come after me after lunch, Amit Bhaduri, because when I found out that I would be on the same program with him on the first day for the introductory lectures, I was incredibly honored and delighted. And I would say that when I was at the stage of my career where many of you are today, finishing my doctoral studies and starting out as a young economist, Amit was one of the most influential and encouraging people in the early stages of my career. My work had some parallels with his. In the last few years, we have celebrated the quarter-century anniversary of something now known as the Bhaduri-Margolin model, sometimes mislabeled the Margolin-Bhaduri model. And it actually we're up to 28 years now. And it's probably more than 30 since I saw early versions of that famous model presented by Amit at various conferences and even a summer school in Trieste, Italy in 1987. Now, you should not think that Amit Bhaduri has spent the last 30 years working on the same model. He has long since moved on to other things, and you will see some of that here at the conference. But while he's moved on, an enormous part of the Post-Keynesian branch of the profession has spent these 3 decades working out the implications of the Bhaduri-Margolin model and, in the part I will emphasize in my presentation, attempting to estimate that model and related models empirically. And so it's been enormously influential. So I just wanted to give what we call in the States a shout out to Amit. Okay, so in my own talk, it had different titles depending on whether you read the program or the emails that you received. So this is the title closer to the program, Introduction to Post-Keynesian Theories of Distribution and Growth. But what it's really about is mostly the empirical literature that I was referring to. So I'm going to begin with this, I think is another American expression, a shameless advertisement for a book that will hopefully be forthcoming sometime next year, we hope in the spring, with my co-author Mark Setterfield, who will be here later today, he hopes in time for dinner at least. The book is entitled Heterodox Macroeconomics, Models of Demand, Distribution, and Growth, and we are still feverishly working on the final stages of the manuscript. And also some of the work I will present toward the end of this presentation is taken, with permission of course, from the work of one of my doctoral students who just completed his degree at American University, Mike Colville, currently teaching at Ithaca College in New York State. He regrets he cannot be here now. He does plan to make a presentation at the Eastern Economics Association, so I encourage everyone to go see that. Okay, so the topic of income distribution and economic growth really is as old as the field of economics. It goes back to Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, and all the classical economists. And so one of the great questions that has concerned economists now for more than 2 centuries is, does a society have to endure worse inequality in order to grow more rapidly and to create employment for its people? Or is it possible for growth and employment creation to be consistent with greater distributive equity? So those are great questions, and the work of the classical economists, one might say, helped to make this known as the dismal science, because in the early theories, it generally appeared that faster growth required that a higher share of national income be devoted to profits, and that would essentially mean greater inequality between at least capitalists and workers. And you can find that in the work of Ricardo and Marx, and in a somewhat different version in the model of a dual economy by Lewis, Ranis, and Fay, in Kaldor's early work, many places, and it was also enshrined in the famous Kuznets curve in empirical development economics, which seemed to find that in at least the early stages of development, inequality would worsen while per capita income rose, although eventually that would be reversed. Piketty, of course, has cast considerable doubt on the inevitability of that reversal. But in recent years, a growing amount of empirical research has found quite the opposite conclusion, that lower inequality by various metrics is often associated with more rapid economic growth, or in some cases, more sustainable economic growth. And in the debates and discussions about secular stagnation, rising inequality is often seen as one of the leading suspects or contributing factors to that trend. So that's just a broad overview. But what I'm going to focus on here this morning is the post-Keynesian approach, which focuses on demand-led growth and particularly the functional distribution of income. So, turning to the post-Keynesian approach, the emphasis here is on demand-led models. In the post-Keynesian view, aggregate demand is the driving force in determining output, not only in the short run, as in mainstream Keynesian models, but also in the long run, where it is believed that aggregate supply or potential output adjusts endogenously in the long run through a variety of mechanisms, such as increases in productivity through the Kaldor's laws and especially the Verdun law, and endogenous changes in the capital stock, labor force participation, and so on. And in some versions, though this is not a debate I was intending to enter into this morning, the utilization of capacity also varies in the long run, but certainly not everybody agrees with that, and I don't think it's essential to the overall Keynesian vision which way you come out on that, though that itself is a controversial statement. But what is common in all the different post-Keynesian models, in addition to the driving role of demand, is the idea that income distribution affects aggregate demand in significant ways. And we typically measure aggregate demand, for the short run at least, by utilization rates, meaning output relative to potential or full capacity output by some definition. And later on I'm going to show you that the definition of what that means empirically is actually quite problematic, or growth rates for long-run analysis. Now, in this work and in what I will focus on this morning, the main emphasis has been on the functional distribution of income, which means between labor and capital income broadly defined. I will use wages and profits as a shorthand for that, but of course each of those is complex in its own way. Labor income includes both wages and salaries, and also employer-paid benefits and contributions for social insurance and things like that. And profit income or capital income, of course, can be broken down into interest and dividends that are paid out to households and net retained profits of firms and various other categories. More recent work, and there will probably be many species of this at the different sessions around the conference this weekend, has introduced other dimensions of income distribution into these post-Keynesian models between the financiers and firms, or so-called rentiers and firms, and also income inequality between genders, between male and female workers, or inequality between different groups of labor, like managers and workers more broadly. But turning back to the basic models, in just kind of textbook fashion and without going into all the equations and math, we can review the impact of income distribution on aggregate demand through the main components of, on the private side, consumption, investment, and net exports. So for consumption, the theory is pretty clear, and the empirical evidence is overwhelming. The marginal propensity to consume is higher out of labor income or wages, broadly defined, than out of capital income or profits. That is the single most robust result in all of the empirical literature. And it's something that is acknowledged, even if mainstream economists do not typically take this into account in their models. In policy discussions, people as diverse as, say, Larry Summers and Alan Greenspan have acknowledged that a tax cut to the workers is going to result in more consumption than a tax cut for the wealthy. So that's actually pretty undisputed. Investment gets more challenging because I think the net effect of a higher share of income going to labor or wage share on investment is theoretically ambiguous. But there are various channels through which this can operate. So first of all, if we focus on what economists have traditionally focused on the most, which is business investment or corporate investment, then we generally think that the direct effect, at least, of a higher labor share is negative because wages are a cost to the firms. This is going to squeeze their profit margins, reduce their profits, assuming there's some positive response of investment, business investment to profitability. This effect should be negative. And in the theoretical literature lying behind this are issues about why profits matter. It's partly because of financial constraints. So the fact that profits retained by the firms or cash flow is emphasized by Hyman Minsky, relieve financial constraints on firms. And more is emphasized by Joan Robinson, that profits today are seen as a proxy for expected profits in the future. So that part's pretty clear, but then there are some counteracting factors. So secondly, something we have learned in the last few decades, and especially the last 10 years since the financial crisis, is that there's another very important part of investment. That's housing. And in countries like the United States and Spain and earlier in Japan, we saw housing bubbles and housing crises that had a major impact on our economies. And I would say that new work in economics and impact of financial crises is definitely focusing a lot more on that aspect. But if housing is widely owned by working class families, then the wage share could actually have a positive effect on that component of investment. And then lastly, there are indirect effects. So even if the direct effect of wages on investment is negative, but if high wages boost consumption a lot and there's a strong accelerator effect, as analyzed by Baduri and Margolin way back in their 1990 papers, you could actually get a net overall effect, direct and indirect, that is positive. So that's why I say that the impact on investment overall is ambiguous theoretically, even though for each component we can say how it might work. Lastly, there's the international dimension, which is very important, and I think the empirical studies have found this, and that is that on the trade side, higher labor costs in a given country can make that nation's products less competitive and can lead to a reduction in the trade balance or net exports. And nowadays that happens not just through the sort of conventional shifting of where firms and people buy their products from at home or abroad, but also through offshoring and global value chains where pieces of the production process can be relocated from the US to Mexico or Mexico to China or China to Vietnam or somewhere else based on comparisons of labor costs for some particular portion of the production process. So adding all these things together, it's obviously quite ambiguous whether demand as a whole is wage-led or profit-led as the terminology goes. And it is therefore an empirical question. Before I turn to the empirical studies, though, let me just summarize the two possible cases or situations or demand regimes which have become known as, one is either stagnationism, that was the term used by Baduri and Margolin, or more commonly today it's referred to as wage-led demand on the one hand, and exhilarationism or profit-led demand on the other hand. So basically in the stagnationist or wage-led case, the positive effects on consumption dominate, the accelerator effects on investment are strong, the net export effects are weak, and so the overall effect of higher wages or a higher wage share on demand and output is positive. And this was found in some of the original models of Kalecki and Steindl, and in the early generations of neo-Kaleckian models by people like Don Harris, Tony Esmacopoulos? Sorry, I'm blanking out. Del Monte, an Italian author, Bob Rothorn, Amitabh Dutt, Lance Taylor, Edward Amadeo, and many others, 1970s and early 80s, basically. To date myself, that's when I was a graduate student. The opposite case of exhilarationism or profit-led demand is essentially where the negative direct effects of higher labor costs on business investment are very strong. The net export effects are strong. And in that case, a redistribution to profits is stimulating while a redistribution to labor is contractionary. And this was originated in sort of two strands of work, the work of Baduri and Margolin in their two 1990s papers, and they focused mainly on the investment function, and my own work published in 1989 on where I focused on the net export side. Caveats before we proceed further. None of this theoretical literature implies that a country can uniquely be classified as wage-led or profit-led. That's really quite a mistake. First of all, even in the most basic models, the conditions for overall demand to be wage-led or profit-led and for growth, or essentially the investment to capital ratio, to be wage-led or profit-led are different in general. So a country could be wage-led in one respect and profit-led in another respect. And also, a growing literature has recognized that the distinction, let's say we take it for demand, is endogenous. That is, it's a function of many different parameters of the economy which can change and evolve over time. I emphasize the openness to international trade, which makes the net export effects more important. Also, you can look at the progressivity of income taxes, because income taxes essentially play the same role as saving rates in the neo-Koletskian model. So if the tax structures were progressive, higher on profit income relative to labor income, that has the same effect as a big gap in the saving propensities, and the result is the economy is more likely to have wage-led demand. So as we move to flatter taxes, more regressive taxes, as the United States unfortunately has under one Republican administration after another, with a lowering of tax rates on the wealthy and raising of taxes on labor, like Social Security taxes, it actually helps to make the economy less wage-led or possibly more profit-led. And then a number of papers, like the work of Laura Carvalho and Armand Rezai and Tom Pally, has shown that inequality in the personal or household distribution of income or in wage income, that is between different groups of workers, can affect whether overall demand is wage-led or profit-led. And then in models that incorporate a financial sector, one of the implications is that the degree of financial payouts by corporations to households through dividends or interest payments, essentially the rentier share of income, can then affect the overall degree of wage-leddedness or profit-leddedness. And that's in the work of Rama Vasudevan. Is she here? Well, she's here at the conference. And Eckhart, I'm sure he'll be around. Okay. And many others. Well, not that many others, actually. More caveats. You know, if you look at the data, you'll always find that when an economy is growing strongly, it has high profits. But that's endogenous. Okay, it doesn't mean that redistributing income to profits is the way to generate that growth. But if the economy is growing strongly and then utilization is high, firms are selling well, they will make high returns to their capital. So one has to be very careful about that. And this is the same thing we see, for example, in a basic Robinsonian kind of model about the paradox of thrift. Raising the saving propensity can depress growth, but if you have, let's say, more positive animal spirits of the entrepreneurs and investment increases, saving, because income gets redistributed to profits will endogenously rise, and savings will endogenously rise. So the realized saving rate will always look high in an economy that's growing strongly. It doesn't mean that tightening the belt and doing austerity is the right way to achieve that. And last but not least, once we recognize all this complexity and particularly the endogeneity of the wage share or profit share itself, the meaning of an economy or a variable being wage-led or profit-led actually becomes quite ambiguous. Some people would argue vacuous. And several authors have complexified these models and shown some of these difficulties. Include Sasaki, is he here? He's coming. Hello, nice to meet you. Love your article, 2011 in Metro Economica. Nikiforos, Mikhailis, is he here? Peter Scott, I don't think he's here this year. Various others have shown this in different contexts. So when you have a very complicated model and many things are endogenous, including income distribution, what is the meaning of being wage-led or profit-led? There are three ways the term could be used. Some people use it to refer to whether in the equilibrium, the association between is positive between the growth, let's say, and the wage share, or growth and the profit share. Another possibility, this is what Michaelis recommended in his paper, was to look at the impact of a shift in the distributional relationship, or what I will call the distribution curve. But I'm going to use the term in a much more narrow sense here, simply to refer to the slope of the aggregate demand relationship. So I'll be looking very strictly at what would be essentially the aggregate demand function or curve as part of a larger macro model, but not at the behavior of the whole model. And the reason I choose that definition for this purpose is because I want to focus on the empirical literature, and really the empirical literature has been estimating, whether it knows it or not, it's been estimating that limited issue. I keep saying this presentation is going to focus on empirics, but I haven't gotten there yet. So one more piece of theory. And now this is a later generation from the Baduri-Margolin model. This really starts with the work of Nelson Barbosa Filho and Lance Taylor in 2006. It's become known as neo-Goodwin models, which are similar to, but not the same as, the original models of the original neo-Marxian model of Richard Goodwin in 1967, which was a strictly neo-Marxian model. The neo-Goodwin model combines some neo-Marxian and neo-Kaleckian features. To make a long story short, the utilization rate is defined, here I get to try out my pointer, as the ratio of output to potential output, U, and the wage share is treated as endogenous, but the only variable it's a function of is the utilization rate. So essentially, you have a system of two differential equations in the two variables, utilization and wage share, psi here, psi dot and u dot. So first order simultaneous differential equations in utilization and the wage share. And we can define the two key relationships here, the null lines or demarcation curves, u dot equals 0, constant utilization rate, we'll call the aggregate demand curve, and psi dot equals 0 is that null line or demarcation curve I will call the distributive curve. I would call it distributive relationship, but in our book, that's a different curve in another chapter, so I have to call it something else. When you write 10 chapters with a co-author, it gets complicated just trying to keep your notation and terminology straight. In the book, by the way, this is mostly in chapter 5 of the book, but there's 9 other chapters, great stuff coming. We present a log linear version of this, and I won't go into the details, but it's actually fairly similar to the original model in Barbosa Filho and Taylor's paper. And then the fun part, of course, is the graphs. And these two graphs, now you need to understand, the model, as I just showed it to you, whether in linear form or general form, log linear or general form, it could generate many different outcomes. So the so-called neo-Goodwin cycles are only one possible case, and it depends on the parameter values. So these two graphs assume certain parameter values, and under other parameter values, you would get totally different outcomes. So the one on the left is probably the most popular version, so I circled it in blue down here. These are stable neo-Goodwin cycles, so they have a counterclockwise. I learned from Mark Setterfield that the British call it anti-clockwise. So counterclockwise or anti-clockwise rotations, but that are convergent, not drawn very well. And that requires that demand is profit-led, which is the downward sloping AD curve in, utilization. That's utilization versus wage share space. And the distributive curve is upward sloping, so that represents something called the profit squeeze. Whoops, I'm still learning by doing with this particular device here. The buttons are all like right next to each other. Let me discuss this. I've already discussed the meaning of whether demand is wage-led or profit-led. So a downward slope just means that as utilization rises, as the wage share rises, utilization is depressed. On the distributive curve, we're looking at the opposite effect, essentially, how the wage share responds to utilization. So the upward slope means that as utilization rises, which through Okun's law would mean higher employment, lower unemployment, wages would rise and squeeze profits. So that's why it's called the profit squeeze. Later on, I'm going to show you that empirically that's actually not what happens, but theoretically that's what's supposed to happen. And that's the neo-Marxian element. So the demand curve is really very Kaleckian, but the profit squeeze hypothesis is more Marxian. So I'm not going to bore you with all the mathematical details. They're on a slide here, and they're in the book and an appendix. We can go into it if there's a question about it. Happy to. But under some other parameter values, Barbosa, Filio, and Taylor find that there could be unstable neo-Goodwin cycles. So that's the diagram over on the right. I think it's a very extreme case. It requires, here I do need to refer to my math, it requires that this coefficient omega 2 has to be positive. So that means that when the wage share rises, it then grows even faster. It's like if workers are stronger and they win a higher wage share, then they're able to make it rise even faster than they were before. I find that rather implausible. And they wave their hands at some empirical studies and claim that they support this. And I think it's pretty weak evidence, frankly. But if you did have this configuration, again, aggregate demand has to be profit-led or downward sloping. This time, the distribution curve has to be downward sloping, which represents something called a wage squeeze, the opposite case, but steeper, and that's important, steeper than the aggregate demand curve, and then you could get cycles that spin outward instead of inward. But under other parameter values, the model does not even generate cycles. So here's two other cases, and all the ones I'm showing you have profit-led demand, just as to keep the comparison, keep something fixed in the comparison. So that everything you've seen has a downward-sloping aggregate demand curve. But if you then have a wage squeeze where the distributive curve is either flatter or steeper under certain parameter values, particularly where that omega 2 coefficient is negative rather than positive, so distribution is basically self-stabilizing. You get either a stable node like over here, or you get a saddle point equilibrium like here, but you don't get cycles. So the cycles really come out under very special conditions. If you go through the matrix math with a Jacobian matrix, and again, I don't want to bore you with too many details, but the important point is that even if you have, let's say, a negative trace of the Jacobian, so your model might be stable, and a positive determinant, which again would mean stable. But then for the adjustment process to be cyclical, you have to have essentially the matrix J must be non-diagonizable with complex characteristic roots. And when you go and figure out what that means, it essentially means that the cross effects, that is the effect of utilization on changes in the wage share and the wage share on changes in utilization, those cross effects have to be very strong relative to the own effects of each variable on its own rate of change. So only if this condition is satisfied do you actually get cycles. And I actually find it kind of curious that in the empirical literature, everybody talks about the signs of their coefficients. I don't recall ever reading anyone checking whether the condition for cycles is satisfied. So someone might want to look into that. Someone who knows more math than I do. Okay. Also, you may not get cycles in another case. So the neo-Goodwin model assumes that essentially the adjustments of output and of wages and prices and distribution all occur in a relatively similar time frame, right? So both variables are adjusting simultaneously. If you take a kind of more conventional Keynesian view that wages and prices are sticky, then wages would not adjust in the short run, and output would adjust fairly quickly. And in that case, you could get these kind of dynamics. They're actually in Lance Taylor's textbook of 2004, just to advertise the competition a little bit. And I don't want to go there. Here I've shown all wage-led demand cases, so AD is sloping upward. But the important point is if output adjusts very quickly, then you're always on the aggregate demand curve. The adjustments are then driven solely by what's going on with distribution. I'm assuming it's self-stabilizing. There's a model underlying that. And you just move, as these arrows show, toward an equilibrium. And in some cases, you can get fun stuff like overshooting or undershooting in response to a shock. But you don't get cycles, per se. You don't get regular cycles. You just get movements toward an equilibrium. Okay, finally on to the empirical studies. By the way, I'll take clarifying questions, but then we can have a broader discussion at the end. Yes? Oh, and if you want to ask a question, I'm supposed to have someone bring you a microphone. So please wait for the microphone, because we are being recorded.
So a clarifying question on the previous slide, right? But what you actually need, because the wage share is the product of average wages and employment, right? So you don't need only the wages and prices to be sticky, but output to adjust faster than employment, right? Because if L adjusts fairly quickly, even if wages are sticky, then the wage share can still adjust.
Yes.
Even if output doesn't adjust. So.
Right. So more precisely, the wage share includes the real wage relative to productivity, basically. We'll cover that later. And so it actually does have short-run adjustments, which are different from longer-term trends. But yes, you're right about that. Yeah. Okay, on to the empirical studies. So there's now quite a large literature about this, and there's a kind of a story behind my focus on this. I worked on other things for many years. In 2009, I got invited to one of those summer schools that you just heard about. And at the end of the summer school, Eckhard Heinz said, "Hey, Robert, wouldn't you like to write up your lecture as a chapter for this book we're going to put out?" I said, "Sure." And I had lectured on open economy, neo-Koletskian models, my basic stuff. And then he said, "Well, could you please add a section to that on the empirical literature?" I said, "Sure." So I read the empirical literature that existed as of 2009, which is then fairly small. So it's amazing how much work has come out in the last 9 years since then. And I just started to grapple with these incredible disparities in the results for different results for the same countries and things like that. But over the last few years, I've started to see a few years after that, I began to see patterns in the studies. And so that's what I'm going to reflect upon here. But this literature has truly mushroomed in the last decade after getting off to kind of a slow start earlier. So most of this literature is focused on estimating what we could call the slope of that AD, aggregate demand curve. Is it positively or negatively sloped? So that's the issue of wage-led or profit-led demand, narrowly defined. But a subset of this literature has also estimated the DC relationship, or distributive curve. And the studies that have done the latter, because I will argue because of some aspects of their methodology, have just uniformly found what they claim is evidence for neo-Goodwin cycles. Well, I will actually show you that I think that interpretation has to be questioned. Okay, empirical framework. So I borrowed this from an article by Engelbert-Stockhammer and co-authors in 2011. I think it was their paper on Germany. Brilliant paper, one of the best of that era. So if we do the standard thing and break, this is just putting in algebra what I told you earlier. Consumption function, investment function, government spending, I can treat as exogenous. Engelbert treated it as endogenous, but I'm simplifying. And net exports, which in turn can be broken down into exports minus imports. Exports and imports have functions, and among other things, they're a function of the prices, so that needs an equation. So it's a kind of a whole block of the model for the trade side, and I think that's the right way to do it rather than trying to estimate a net export function in general. The effects are indicated here: the positive effect of the wage share on consumption, the ambiguous effect on investment, and then for net exports, you don't even see the wage share directly, so it's buried down here in the price equation. Oops. But indirectly through the prices and their effects on the exports and imports, it does affect net exports. The letter Z, if you're British, stands for exogenous variables or shift factors in each equation. The subscript indicates the equation. And of course, there's income effects in various places. And then if a study estimates a distributive curve or distributive relationship, it would generally have this form: wage share as a function of income, and then a vector of exogenous variables. So the terminology here is on the distributive side, down the bottom. A positive sign means a profit squeeze. A negative sign means a wage squeeze. And on the demand side, we take the whole aggregate demand function A positive partial derivative with respect to the wage share means wage-led, negative means profit-led. Then there's 3 different methodologies that have been applied. At first I thought there were 2. Then I realized there's actually a third, although I'm only aware of one single study that does it. So maybe there are others out there. What I call the structural models, though the practitioners call them single equation models, but I like to call them structural models, estimate the different functions that you just saw separately. So there's a consumption function, an investment function. In a few recent papers now, there's a separate function for business investment and housing investment, and net exports, or a trade block of the model with exports and imports and so on. These studies overwhelmingly now, it wasn't so obvious in the beginning, but as the methodologies have gotten refined, and especially I think with better methods of modeling the international trade side, the models are now converging on finding wage-led demand in the larger and more relatively closed economies. United States, European Union as a whole, Germany, and other large economies. But they find profit-led demand, as the theory would predict, by the way, in the smaller and more open economies. I'll give you examples of that in a little bit. The second methodology is I call aggregative models, and some of them are systems models. So these estimate the simultaneous equations for the utilization rate and the wage share. And that started with this work of Barbosa, Filio, and Taylor on the neo-Goodwin cycles, and it's followed with several other studies listed here. And these ones uniformly, except for some very recent exceptions that I'll explain, but until like just the last year or two, they always found profit-led demand and a profit squeeze and claimed they had evidence for neo-Goodwin cycles. Lastly, and again, it hasn't been done very much, but econometrically, it's a very nice thing to do. You can construct a reduced form model by essentially substituting out for all the endogenous variables and then just looking at how the exogenous factors affect the endogenous variables. And the only study I'm aware of that does this is a study by Julio Lopez and some co-authors, Art Spanos and somebody else in 2011 on Mexico. But from those papers, you can't directly tell if something is wage-led or profit-led, but you can look at the underlying determinants. So in the first method, the structural approach, you essentially find a coefficient which you transform into like a partial derivative or partial effect of the wage share at each variable. And as I said, your effects on net exports may come through like a price equation, and then you basically add those up. If your estimates are elasticities, then you have to weight them by the shares of the components of aggregate demand in the total. In the aggregative estimates, in contrast, you just regress the some measure of output or the utilization rate on the wage share, and then hopefully a bunch of exogenous variables, although in practice they often don't include any exogenous variables. If you also estimate a wage share equation, then I would call it a systems estimate. In principle, that can also be done in the first approach, but it has not been done until very recently. And then in the reduced form, since you essentially have substituted out, so you don't see a psi on the right-hand side, you substitute out for the wage share, you have the exogenous drivers of the wage share in the z psi vector over there, and you can look at how those exogenous drivers of distribution affect output or utilization. So this is a table from the book, and I'm going to show it to you on 2 separate slides because it's a very long table. This part shows the structural estimates, or just leading ones. And now my table is not as long as some of the other tables. I'm leaving out some of the very early studies that use very weak econometric methods, and I'm leaving out studies that only look at domestic demand like consumption plus investment and don't include the net exports. So not everything is here. But I mean, you could just see by looking at it, the overwhelming majority are finding wage-led demand. When you drill down to different countries, you find, for example, in Onurang and Galanis, Euro area as a whole, Germany, France, Italy, US, UK, US, UK, Japan, Turkey, South Korea. So a lot of large and emerging economies are wage-led, but they also find Some very open economies like Australia, Canada, Argentina, China, India, Mexico, South Africa are profit-led. And it's driven by the net export effects being very large and negative. So I don't want to bore you by reading all that, but there's lots of studies. One caveat, the results I'm showing you are entirely for a shift in distribution within that country, in the individual country. A few of these studies also look at a simultaneous change in distribution, and that's important because we have seen a simultaneous decline in wage shares around the world in the last 20 or 30 years, and we would like to arrange maybe the opposite, a recovery of wage shares around the world, and you can get very different results in some of these countries over here, not all of them, but some of them shift to being wage-led if there would be a simultaneous increase. So like if we could elect Bernie Sanders at the same time that Mexico has López Obrador, maybe we could improve things. Okay, but when we turn to the aggregative estimates, it's just the opposite. But you can just see the right-hand column is all filled up. There's very few entries in the first column, and they all have 2018 dates. So if we discount everything that just came out this year, and in fact, none of those are even published. Those are all the 2018s are working papers or an unpublished dissertation. Almost every study finds profit-led demand, starting with Barbosa, Filio, and Taylor, also one of my dissertation students, and many, many others. Daniele Tavani, he's here somewhere, and so on. And here's the one study of using the reduced form method. I call it wage-led, focusing on the result for the exchange rate, where they found that a depreciation of the Mexican peso was contractionary, and that would be associated with wage-led demand. Okay. So I already told you all this stuff. So basically, going down the bottom here, so these aggregative studies find mostly profit-led demand and a profit squeeze. It appears to confirm the neo-Goodwin cycles in every country that's been studied, and also international panel data like Kiefer and Rada in 2015. But I will argue that these are strictly short-term results. They don't tell us anything about the longer term. And studies that are starting to look at longer-term relationships, which actually begin in a way with Kiefer and Rada, find something different in the long run. And I'll come back and talk about some of that. So, how do we deal with the fact that one group of studies using one methodology is finding that most countries, especially the larger ones, are wage-led, and another group of studies using a different methodology is finding that those very same countries have profit-led demand. Sorry, I misspoke. I should not say are, the countries are. That they have wage-led demand in one group of studies, and they have profit-led demand in the other group of studies. How can this be? There's got to be something in their methodologies that is driving these results, and somebody's right and somebody's wrong, let's face it. Now, if you've all studied econometrics, or will be in your doctoral programs, and so you know all of the problems that can afflict empirical studies: omitted variable bias, simultaneity bias, measurement error, misspecification of equations, et cetera, et cetera. That's what you study in advanced econometrics. And all results can be sensitive to the measurement. There's many different measures of output and utilization and wages and wage shares. So how do we know we're using the right measure, or are our results robust or not to alternative measures? Now, I don't have time to go through a laundry list of all these things for every study. But for the structural models, I would say the chief criticism has been that they suffer simultaneity bias, because they all take the wage share as exogenous. They also take national income as exogenous. I mean, think about that. Is they all have wage share and income as exogenous variables, but first of all, we probably believe that demand affects distribution somehow, including through the employment side, as someone mentioned, as well as through wages. And what is income? What's the sum of consumption plus investment plus government plus net export? Well, that can't be exogenous either. So do the models suffer from simultaneity bias? And as far as I know, the first person to systematically investigate that, maybe there's someone else out there, but is this PhD student of mine I referred to. And in chapter 2 of his dissertation, in what I consider fairly preliminary results, but he found that the answer is no. So basically, he did in 3 different ways, constructed structural type models, treated the wage share as endogenous in different ways, and in every case, at least where he could find valid instruments for the wage share, and used general method of moments to control for absolutely everything that it controls for, the wage-led result, this is for US data, the wage-led result for the US stands up. And in fact, in the 2 models where you could find valid instruments, the US is even more wage-led in the GMM estimates than in the OLS estimates. Now, this is very preliminary. It's not been published yet, but to me, it's suggesting that simultaneity bias is not accounting for these results. They don't, actually, the bias does not seem to be significant. So let me then talk about the aggregative estimates. Now, how am I doing on time? We're actually going until 12:15, is that correct? Oh my gosh, you guys got to listen to me a long time. All right, at some point you have to start asking more questions. So this leads me to believe that, in fact, the aggregative estimates may be suffering from some kind of bias, and I've identified 3 different kinds of problems with this, of which the 3rd one turns out empirically to be the most important. But I think they all influence these estimates in one way or another. So the first point, which I actually argued in my paper for the series of issues of the Review of Keynesian Economics in honor of the 25th anniversary of the Balduri-Margolin model, is that the results of these neo-Goodwin type studies really only apply to short-run relationships. And in some sense, that's obvious. I mean, it's a model of business cycles, right? So business cycles are short-run. But even if it's true, so even if profits have to rise to lead a country into a recovery out of a recession, falling profits drive an economy into a recession, well, that would not tell you that in order to have a more robust economy in the long run, you need to have a higher average for the profit share. It just doesn't tell you that at all. It doesn't tell you anything about the longer-term average performance. It only would tell you about cyclical relationships. And if you look at the empirical methodologies, the data are often detrended or filtered, and that removes any information about longer-term trends. So all you're seeing are deviations from long-term trends. So it's very clear that this is purely short-run at best. But the second point, and I became aware of this after reading some work and hearing a presentation by 2 women who work at the IMF in Washington, but they're actually doing really, really interesting work, and I urge you to look their work up. So it's Sarah and Saxena, and they have a working paper. It's online. You can download it. So they argue that, well, I'll show you in more detail, but basically all of our conventional measures of utilization rates, or in conventional terms, output caps, are just conceptually flawed. We're looking at the wrong thing, and we have terrible measurement error. And more specifically, and I want to thank Daniele Tavani, is he here yet? Well, he'll be here too, for telling me about this, that there is a very severe critique of the Hodrick-Prescott filter, which is so commonly used. Oh, because it's so easy. You go into eViews, you click on a button, and you do the HP filter. It's so easy, even I can do it. Except it's wrong. And so James Hamilton is one of the greatest time series econometricians, has published a paper arguing that HP filters are just completely spurious and you should never, ever use them. And last but not least, an argument that Marc Lavoie has made in several of his publications, most recently a 2017 paper, but all going way back to his work in the 1990s, is that, and I think this goes to the question I got about employment, productivity is endogenous in the short run, and it adjusts in a way that could create a false impression of profit-led demand. So I will explain that in more depth. But I also have to say that argument goes way back to Howard Sherman, an American radical economist of the 1970s and 80s, and my former colleague at American University, Robin Hanel, now retired, who co-authored a paper about this way back in 1982 in a critique of what were then the profit squeeze arguments in the literature of the late 70s. So the first point, just to quickly summarize what I argued in my 2016 paper, I argued that the wage-led effects on demand tend to be more long-term in their operation, while the profit-led effects tend to be more short-term. So on the consumption side, and again, this is something we should have learned from recent behavior, consumer spending is actually not so bound by income in the short run, because consumers can borrow. We know they can get heavily indebted, or they can spend down retirement savings. But in the longer term, income constraints bite on at least working class consumers, maybe not on the very wealthy. But that's exactly the point. So the positive association of wages and consumption should be seen more strongly in long-term data than in short-term data. On the investment side, however, the positive effect of profits in some ways may be just a short-run effect. If you think about Minsky's theory of investment, retained profits matter mostly or entirely because they relieve financial constraints, which in turn come from well, I'm about to flip in my head from Minsky to Stiglitz. In Stiglitz's view, it comes from asymmetric information between borrowers and lenders, or in Keynesian terms, uncertainty about the future. So will the borrowers be able to pay back the lenders? Nobody really knows, but if the firm has a strong cash flow, then the lenders will be willing to lend anyway, because they don't care whether the investment project will pay off or not. They just care about being paid back as lenders, and a strong cash flow will say, yes, the firm can pay back. But the long-term demand for investment comes largely from accelerator effects, from the need for capital stock to keep up with growing output, and that's not really influenced by profitability. And lastly, on the export side, higher wages could have a depressing effect on net exports, but we know there's lots of adjustment mechanisms, currency appreciation and so on, or depreciation, I should say, and adjustment mechanisms that can offset that after some period of time. So putting all that together, I conjectured that profit-led effects would be more observed in the short run, while wage-led effects might be more long-term. And a few studies are actually starting to find something like that. So there's a paper in Mainstream Growth Theory, very good one, by Halter et al. In 2014. They looked at personal income inequality, Gini coefficients, not functional distribution. They had data for 106 countries using 8 5-year periods. You see all the details up there, the usual kitchen sink of control variables. And they find that a higher inequality has a positive effect on growth after controlling for everything in the universe in the first 5-year period after the current period, but then the longer term effects are all negative, and the net effect in the long term is negative. That is a negative effect of higher inequality. There's one paper in Mexico by Vargas Sanchez and Luna in 2014. I have a few doubts about some of their econometrics, and there's a few typos in the article. I had to have some emails with the authors to clarify what they meant, but basically they found that Mexican output is profit-led in the short run and wage-led in the long run, which is exactly what I was arguing. Kiefer and Rada have an interesting part of their paper. Mostly they find the same thing that the other aggregative studies find for the short run, profit-led demand and a profit squeeze. So they say they have evidence for neo-Goodwin cycles, but they also do something very interesting and innovative. They allow the equilibrium levels of utilization and the wage share to be functions of time. And in various ways, they test for how these change over time. Is there a linear trend, or is there a one-time shift, or a stochastic fluctuation? And what they find is that in the long run, the two variables have a positive association. Now, I say association deliberately because their method does not tell you the causality, the direction of causality between the variables in the long term. but it's at least consistent with the possibility that demand is wage-led in the longer term. And then Sharp et al. Use wavelet analysis, and please do not ask me what it is because it is totally over my head in terms of econometrics. I don't even know if it is econometrics, but it's some kind of statistical procedure that somehow allows you to distinguish the direction of the relationship between variables at different time horizons. And they find, to make a long story short, in data for 3 countries, US, UK, and France, very long-term data, basically, the wage share has a negative effect on growth. They don't look at utilization, on the growth rate at shorter horizons and a positive effect at longer horizons. And that is confirmed in at least one other study by Araujo and Costa Santos this year. It's a totally unpublished working paper, although Borales and Van Arnhem found, it was Rudy's not here, I guess, profit-led cycles more generally, but they had shorter data. Okay, on to the second argument, and this is the one from Serra and Saxena. Here's the full title of their paper, and they have several earlier papers. So over here on the left is the traditional view of business cycles. It's probably in your introductory textbook that you have to teach from at your university in order to mislead your students. You know, that kind of textbook. Maybe you don't use that textbook. Good for you. So there's supposedly a long-term trend of output. This should really be output in logs, which is constant and independent of any demand-side factors, and it's driven by, I don't know, a Solow model, a Romer model, take your pick of supply-side neoclassical growth models. And then if you get a recession, output falls, and after some time it goes back to its previous trend, and we march along in our merry way, just like we were doing before. So the short-run demand fluctuation has no impact on the long-term trend. Well, Serra and Saxena, in a previous series of studies, looked at actual economic crises and recessions in countries all around the world, developing countries, emerging market countries, industrial countries, and they found that generally that is not what happens. Just from a purely statistical point of view, what happens is more like this. You're going along a trend, you have a recession, and you do recover, but typically you never go back to the previous trend. You grow permanently along a lower trend. Check out Latin America after the debt crisis of the 1980s. Check out the US economy and Europe since the crisis of 10 years ago, and many, many other cases. This is the more typical pattern. You occasionally see this in very small recessions, like the ones the United States had in the 1950s and 60s, but this is the more common pattern. But our measures of utilization assume this, or assume something like it, so they're not measuring the right things. And furthermore, what happens if you use a typical filter like Hodrick-Prescott? Well, Hodrick-Prescott does something even worse. The good news is Hodrick-Prescott will recognize that the trend has shifted. The bad news is that because it weights past and future data, lags and leads, it will tell you that the trend of potential output started to shift down several quarters or even years before the cycle peak. Now, nobody at that time thought the cycle was turning down, thought the potential was turning down. It wasn't. There was no decline in potential, but the HP filter trend will tell you there was. And so you get a complete mismeasurement. I mean, look at the true magnitude of a recession, for example, compared to the previous trend versus what the HP filter is going to tell you is a teeny-weeny little fluctuation. And there's a spurious appearance of a big spike in utilization before the crisis, when in fact it never occurred. Well, okay, so that's bad for the Hodrick-Prescott filter. What if you measure potential output some other way? So the most common other method is a neoclassical model with an aggregate production function. So Philip's going to be wincing right away. So you have potential output is defined by a supposedly exogenous trend of total factor productivity and then some function of capital, maybe human capital and labor. But everything on the right-hand side here is endogenous in the long run and can respond to demand pressures. If there's depressed demand, firms will invest less, so there'll be less physical capital. If there's economic crisis, people may postpone education and therefore delay the increase or not increase their human capital. In addition, workers leave the labor force, so their skills may have attrition or may sort of depreciate, or they may not keep up with technology. And of course, labor force participation is also endogenous, as are other variables like migration trends. So it's really not exogenous on the right-hand side. And you can see this in, these are from the US data, forecasts or measures of potential output by the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office, one of the last bastions of actual facts in the US, so I give them some credit for not bending to political trends, but they have continuously adjusted downward their estimates of potential output. So the black line here shows the actual output, actual real GDP, and there's the crisis of 2008 and 9. And you see, by the way, everything is indexed to 100 in 2007, which was the previous peak, and you see exactly what Sarah and Saxena told you, right? The recession is you go down, and then we had a recovery where we came back up, but we never got to the previous trend. So the red line up here was the CBO estimate of potential GDP made in January 2008. So right when the recession was starting, we didn't even know we had a recession yet. And this is what the CBO was forecasting would be potential output, like by 2017, it would be almost 30% higher than in 2007. By 4 years later, in January 2012, they had downgraded the forecast to this one. And by 4 years later, January 2016, even before major political shifts, they had downgraded to this green line here. Oh, look! We're at potential, aren't we? Isn't that terrific? Well, the only reason we're at potential is potential isn't what it used to be, or what we thought it used to think it would be. I don't know what grammatical tense to use for that. Now, by the way, there would be one solution to this if someone really wants to do some work. Do you all know what real-time data is? You can get data. I know we have it for the US. There's very good repositories of this. Data as originally estimated and not revised. Because as you see, everything gets revised. Even the actual GDP gets revised. So if you would find the CBO measure of real GDP for each year, but done in that year, it might actually be reasonably accurate given their methodology. But don't use an ex post estimate, estimated out here, that it says, oh, really our potential wasn't so high after all. So that would be something you could do. Now, I come to a study with the provocative title of Why You Should Never Use the Hodrick-Prescott Filter, and that is the exact title of Hamilton's forthcoming article in Review of Economics and Statistics. Last time I checked, it's still just available in online form, but you can download it. The basic point is, I already showed you. The HP filter brings future and past data into the calculation of the trend in such a way that it's not an accurate reflection of what anybody would know about at the time that they're making decisions. So from an econometric, even neoclassical viewpoint, it makes absolutely no sense. In more technical terms, they conclude, and I quote, Hodrick-Prescott introduces spurious dynamic relations that have no basis in the underlying data-generating process. It's a pretty strong critique from an econometrician. And quote, this is really important, by the way, filtered values at the end of the sample are very different from those in the middle and are also characterized by spurious dynamics. Now, why do I say that's so important? Well, a lot of us think there might be structural breaks or shifts in these relationships. And sure enough, people have found them. One of those studies I quoted, Carvalho and Rezai, found, I think, the demand became more profit-led after some point. Well, guess what? If you use an HP filter, you're probably always going to find a structural break because the data are different at the end of the period than they were in the middle and earlier. It's a statistical artifact. You can't tell anything about a structural change in a variable that doesn't have the same statistical properties in different parts of your sample period. And there were earlier studies that also made these points, but less broadly. So I would say never, I would agree with that, never ever use, and this is to professors out here, don't let your students use an HP filter for anything except comparisons with previous studies. Then you should use it to see if the previous results were robust or not. Hamilton does not really critique, but he gives us a new cycle measure. It's an interesting one. I think it's not perfect, but it's a big improvement. It's so easy, even I can do it. There's no button for it in eViews, but like even I can program that. You take output at h periods in advance of period t and regress it on a constant plus 4 lagged realizations of output, and or any variable. Y here could actually, this is econometrics. Y could be any variable. 4 lagged realizations, but starting h periods previously. And for quarterly data, he recommends using h equals 8. So if you think of a business cycle as lasting no more than 2 years, you're essentially looking back at a forecast from 2 years earlier and before of what output would have been based on the information available 2 years and up to 2 years and 3 quarters earlier. The trend, of course, would be the fitted value, and then the estimated residual, what Greek letter is that? Nu t plus h hat is the cycle. You've just got your cycle right there in the fitted value. If your y variable is the natural log of GDP, then that's a logarithmic output gap. You've got a utilization rate. Really easy, I like to say. I can do it. And, in fact, I did it. And here's what it looks like, because I am not a high-powered econometrician, I'll tell you that. So the blue line is the actual U.S. Real GDP in logs since 2000, quarterly. You see, of course, the Great Recession here. The brown or reddish-brown line is Hodrick-Prescott trend. You see what it does? It claims that, like, in 2004, we were already having a slowdown in potential output, and then, of course, potential just nicely goes right over to where we were after a little bit of recovery, so we're just doing fine and hunky-dory ever since. The Hamilton fitted value doesn't look like that, so it shows that the trend, I mean, it's really not potential, so that I shouldn't use that word for Hamilton. It's really more like a trend. The Hamilton trend continues to increase for, guess what, 8 quarters or 2 years after the peak. But then, and this is what I don't like about it, it then precipitously declines, guess when? 8 quarters or 2 years later. So that's the only problem with it that I can find, is that it's not obvious why one would think that output just suddenly dropped 2 years. Was it exactly in 2011 when people said, gosh, that recession was so big we must have a lower trend now? I don't know. I think that was more of a gradual realization. So there's probably some room for the statistically enabled here to improve on this Hamilton measure, but it seems like a good start. But it has great statistical properties, which he tells you about in that article. And let me show you what this does also for the US data. By the way, I did my estimates from 1960. I just showed you starting in 2000, just so you could see it more clearly. This does go back to 1960. Compare measures of the log, essentially the log utilization rate or log output gap, using the two methods. I got to walk over here now. So the Hodrick-Prescott is this one. And look how the Great Recession looks like a little small dip, much smaller than, say, the recessions of the 1970s. Whereas the Hamilton measure says, yes, that was a very, very big recession in 2008 and 2009, although we also had some big ones earlier, which is correct. Okay, third point, short-run endogeneity of labor productivity. So in the earliest neo-Koletskian models, like Harris and Esimakopoulos and Rothorn, and also in just about everything Mark Lavoie has read, and the rest of us have not paid nearly enough attention to, they include overhead labor. And by the way, also in the original work of Koletsky, somebody named Michal Koletsky. They always included overhead labor. And if you have overhead labor, as all these models demonstrate, You get an endogenous variation in labor productivity as demand fluctuates because firms do not lay off or fire overhead workers as much as they do the production workers. So overhead laborers like managers, supervisors, research and development staff, business staff, accountants, lawyers, executives, they do get laid off some, but let's pretend for theoretical purposes that total employment is the sum of production workers L0, overhead labor L1. L1 is fixed. L0 is proportional to output. And then, without going into too much detail, the profit share will be inversely. Better read my own slide. The profit share is positively related to output. Yes, that's what it looks like. Okay. I think it's time for my coffee break, but we don't get one for another half hour. So if output goes down in a recession, naturally the profit share will fall. Not because of wages rising, but because simply the firms have not laid off all of their overhead workers. And so, of course, then therefore the wage share will be negatively related to utilization. And this means that you can get a spurious impression of profit-led demand, because you may see this inverse relationship between the wage share and output or utilization over the business cycle, but in fact, that's the wrong direction of causality. It's really the demand shock or demand fluctuation driving a change in the relative share because of the change in labor productivity and not because of a change in the wage. All right. And you see, like this is US data for the wage share, a very broad definition. You see that it's very cyclical, but the question is what drives it? So now I am going to come to the work of my dissertation student, Mike Colville. This is from chapter 1. And so in this chapter, he looked at the robustness or sensitivity of the aggregate studies, which up to that point had primarily found profit-led demand and a profit squeeze. The data is quarterly data for the US from 1947 to 2016. The method is very simple and transparent, vector autoregression with a Cholesky decomposition. As you probably know, that imposes an ordering, that you have to assume an ordering which imposes a restriction in the sense that the variables that come first in the ordering are not contemporaneously affected by the variables that come later in the ordering. And we can discuss in the Q&A why that is a good or not a good approach. But you'll see what comes out of this. In the baseline model, he does something similar to what previous studies have done, and that is to look at just two variables, the wage share and utilization, with an ordering that puts the wage share first. So utilization has no contemporaneous, by assumption, utilization has no contemporaneous effects on the wage share. So that's ruling out the endogeneity of the wage share that I just showed you. Then, and also he started out using the Hodrick-Prescott filter, but once he became aware of Hamilton, I said, Mike, you got to use the Hamilton. So he uses both as another sensitivity test. By the way, in your dissertation, if you go to your advisor and say, which way should I measure something? The answer is yes. Both. Try everything. See what happens. Then think about it. Okay. So in the baseline model, he finds the usual result. Actually, why don't I just show you we can have fun. This will wake you up. Actual empirical results. So these are the impulse responses in the most basic model replicating earlier studies. It is using the Hodrick-Prescott filter for comparison purposes. An innovation or shock to the wage share has a negative effect, and it's significant on utilization out to like 6 or 7 quarters. Well, 4 or 5 are significant. And although there's, by assumption, no contemporaneous effect, the shocks to utilization have a positive effect on the wage share, so that appears to confirm the profit squeeze over on the right and profit-led demand over on the left. And this is the sort of result that has been taken to support neo-Goodwin cycles. Okay, but how do we control for this productivity issue? So there's 2 approaches that Mike used. One is to essentially break up the wage share into its components, the real wage and productivity. So that's real compensation per hour for all employees and output per hour of all employees. By the way, in the true decomposition, which is down here, there's a third variable, which is the relative price of consumer goods, because the wage share is deflated, the real wage is deflated by the consumer prices and not the output prices. But that has very long-term trends. It doesn't have any short-term fluctuations. So that's the justification for omitting it. If you don't like that method, then another one is to do a cyclical adjustment to the wage share. So he estimates the cyclical component of productivity by applying either method, either Hodrick-Prescott or Hamilton, to the productivity series, estimate the cyclical component, then take that out of the wage share measure, and you get a cyclically adjusted wage share. And when you try either of those methods, you get very different results. But before I get there, I forgot to show you this one. So in the baseline model using Hamilton, it's actually you still see the profit-led demand result. In fact, it lasts for, guess what, 8 quarters. There is something fishy about his 8-quarter thing. So we still see wage-led demand. On the other hand, we see profit-led demand. The profit squeeze becomes mostly insignificant. So it makes some difference there. All right, now we come to these adjusted measures. So if we separate the productivity from the real wage, these are, of course, just a sample of many, many impulse responses, and the results do depend on the ordering. So the ordering used here is compensation first, utilization second, and productivity third. This is the preferred ordering, but there's 3 orderings that generate something similar, and then 3 that are more different, which we argue are not the better ones. So here you see exactly what Mark Lavoie has been arguing, and Hanel and Sherman argued earlier, and what we expect from the original work of Koletsky and Rothorn and so forth and so on. In the first quarter, once we allow for that contemporaneous effect, we see it big time. So a shock to utilization has a very strong positive and significant effect on productivity of labor in the first quarter. And only in the first quarter, then it disappears. In fact, it partly reverses. Once we control for that, we have wage-led demand. Although the definition's a little different, because this is the response of utilization to hourly compensation, the real wage. But a shock to the real wage has a positive effect, not quite significant, but a positive effect on utilization. And no evidence for any kind of profit squeeze whatsoever. So basically no effect of demand conditions on the real wage in the short run. Short run is basically the real wage is acyclical, which actually we should have known, because all the mainstream studies find that. They're actually right. Well, most of them. Now this is using the Hodrick-Prescott filter, but if we do the same thing with Hamilton, we get mostly a similar picture. The big positive effect of utilization or demand on productivity in the first quarter. Wage-led demand, now significant in the first few quarters, and no evidence of a profit squeeze. This is completely inconsistent with the neo-Goodwin cycle. You cannot get a neo-Goodwin cycle when this coefficient is 0, basically, and this one is positive instead of negative. If you do the adjustment to the wage share instead, even stronger results. This is using HP. We have wage-led demand and no profit squeeze. And using Hamilton, wage-led demand that lasts even longer and no profit squeeze. So the profit squeeze is a complete statistical artifact of essentially doing this the wrong way. So what does this mean? Yes, I am going to wrap up soon. So the neo-Goodwin model has been popular for a couple of reasons. One is it seemed to have all this empirical support, that we see that once we pick it apart, the support rather collapses. But also it tells an intuitively appealing story, and for those of us raised up in the radical neo-Marxian tradition, it really resonates. I mean, I kind of learned this when I was a kid, so to speak. So in a boom, we have rising output and employment. It makes labor stronger. Workers bargain for higher wages. This squeezes profits. And then firms invest less, so eventually we go into the recession. In the recession, employment falls, workers get weaker, their bargaining strength weakens. By the way, this is in Phillips curves models too, so maybe those should be rethought. And as wages fall, profits recover, and the higher profits lead the recovery. And so we get this counter-cyclical or anti-cyclical rotation. And in this story, it's the distributional changes that drive the cycles. They're the causal sort of linchpin of the cycles. The empirical evidence I've just showed you is not consistent with that. They suggest a different story. Yes, there are counter-cyclical rotations. The data do sort of roughly cycle around like that. Von Arnim and Barales found that. But the causation is totally different. So what the data I just showed you suggest is something else, that the cycles are driven by demand fluctuations. Now, those in turn have to have a cause. They may be due to financial crises. They may be due to monetary policies that raise interest rates too fast in a boom. They may be due to fiscal austerity or the intrinsic mechanisms of Herodian instability, covered in Chapter 6 of our book. But some kind of demand-side mechanism causes the swings in utilization. The movements in the wage share are completely endogenous and are an artifact of the rising or falling productivity of labor, falling in the recession, rising in the recovery. So the movements in the wage share are effects rather than causes of the cycles. So I've got a few slides on takeaways, and then I think we have a little time for discussion. What the data suggest is that the real wage is sticky in the short run. It does not respond to demand shocks or short-run variations in unemployment, as is required in the profit squeeze theory. But secondly, I think there's a bigger takeaway from this. Maybe we've been putting too much attention to the wage share or profit share in our empirical work. If we decompose the wage share into its different components, the wages, prices, productivity, we find that each of them has their own dynamic, and they're going to have very different effects on demand and on the economy, and they also have different determinants, and we need to distinguish those. So by kind of meshing them or mushing them all together into the wage share, we're actually missing a lot of what's going on. And then we need to look at the causes of distributional shifts. It is why, for example, is the wage share falling in most of the Western economies? Well, one reason could be weaker bargaining power of labor. Another reason could be, these are not mutually exclusive, another reason could be rising profit markups of firms. So there's a fascinating new study by two economists, De Blecker and Eickhout. It's out in an NBR working paper, 2017, showing rising markups in U.S. firms. It's incredible. It's like Steindl is coming back to life. Or it could be productivity variations, which kind of are forgotten about in the profit squeeze story. So we need to look at what's going on underneath and not just at the wage share itself. And these different causes of distributional shifts can have very different implications for the macroeconomy. When we analyze short-run cycles, we should not be thinking about changes in wages or profit squeezes driving those. We should be looking at other mechanisms. And I think the more recent heterodox literature is doing that, certainly with all the attention to financial instability and austerity policies and the like. But for longer-term trends, then I think maybe the income distribution side has more to tell us than it does for the short-run cycles. I do believe that persistent long-term stagnation may be related to the downward trend in wage shares over the past 20 or 30 years in so many countries. And there, again, we need to look at the underlying causes. Certainly higher markups of firms, as De Blecker and Eickhout have found, could be a big part of that story, and it would resonate with the much earlier work of Steindl. A few qualifications. All the results I showed you are preliminary, so much more research is needed to confirm them. And a word about the structural models. So I actually conclude that the structural models are more reliable, and that they're telling us something important. And the fact that they come up with sensible results, like bigger, more closed economies are more wage-led, smaller, more open economies are more profit-led, that's very sensible. That's in line with our theory. But we should remember that because not every economy is wage-led, at least not for individual country changes. And so that can create dilemmas. Let's say the new López Obrador government in Mexico wants to have redistributive policies, which it does, but the Mexican economy is profit-led in the short run, not in the long run, so that could create some dilemmas for policy. On the other hand, if it's the minimum wage and that's not what workers are paid in the export sector, maybe it's okay. But we really need to drill down to the details to see how distributive or redistributive policies are going to impact the economy in a particular context. And last but not least, just to forestall a criticism, yes, of course, this is not an entire macro model. This is one relationship, the aggregate demand relationship that I focused on, and a second one, the distributive curve, which I've argued should be essentially broken up into a wage curve, a price curve, and a productivity relationship. But we ought to at least have our story straight on this part of our macro model as we proceed to embellish it, or not just embellish it, but to make all the necessary additions in terms of modeling all those other things that I've talked about. And with that, I'll stop.